Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of history's most misunderstood and absolutely fascinating civilizations. Before we begin this journey through blood, ice, and legend, take a moment to hit that subscribe button, but only if you're genuinely interested in uncovering the truth behind the myths. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what you already know about the Vikings. I'm always curious to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe pour yourself something warm, and let's step back into a world that shaped our modern civilization in ways most people never realize. The myth and the reality. Close your eyes for a moment and picture a Viking. What do you see? Probably a massive bearded warrior with a horned helmet, right? Maybe he's screaming incoherently while swinging an axe, covered in the blood of innocent monks, representing everything barbaric and uncivilized about the so-called Dark Ages. Here's the thing. Almost everything in that picture is wrong. The horned helmets never happened. That was actually a 19th century invention by costume designers for Wagner's operas. The mindless berserker image? A complete misunderstanding of one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated military and commercial cultures. The idea that they were just raiders and destroyers, that ignores the fact that the Vikings created some of the most extensive trade networks in human history, established legal systems that influenced modern democracy, reached North America 5 centuries before Columbus, and literally shaped the genetic and cultural landscape of half of Europe. The real story of the Vikings is so much more fascinating than the myths. Over the next few hours, we're going to trace the complete arc of Viking civilization from its mysterious beginnings in the harsh landscapes of Scandinavia to its transformation into the medieval kingdoms that would dominate northern Europe. We'll explore how these people evolved from tribal farmers into explorers who reached 4 continents, traders who connected civilizations from Greenland to Baghdad, and innovators whose achievements in shipbuilding, navigation, law, and governance wouldn't be matched for centuries. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. The Vikings didn't just conquer and disappear into history like so many other warrior cultures. They fundamentally transformed themselves and the world around them, evolving from pagan raiders into Christian kings, from tribal societies into centralized nations, from oral cultures into literary civilizations that preserve some of the greatest works of medieval literature. And I've spent the better part of a year researching this, diving into primary sources, archaeological reports, and the latest DNA evidence that's revolutionizing our understanding of who the Vikings actually were. We're going to cover discoveries that most documentaries completely miss, challenge assumptions you've probably held your entire life, and trace connections between the Viking Age and our modern world that will genuinely surprise you. Chapter 1. The Forge of the North. The land that shaped legends. Let's go back to the beginning, long before the word Viking existed, to understand the forces that created one of history's most remarkable civilizations. We're talking about Scandinavia in the 5th and 6th centuries, a landscape so extreme that it seems designed to either kill you or forge you into something extraordinary. Picture this. You're standing on the coast of Norway in the year 500 AD. Behind you rise mountains that look like the bones of dead gods, piercing through the earth. These aren't gentle hills. They're vertical walls of granite that cut the landscape into isolated valleys, each one separated from its neighbors by terrain so forbidding that they might as well be different worlds. In front of you stretches the North Sea, grey and cold and absolutely merciless, dotted with thousands of islands that create a maze of channels, fjords, and sheltered bays. This is a land of impossible extremes. In summer, the sun barely sets, creating an endless twilight that allows crops to grow with surprising speed. But winter brings darkness so complete and prolonged that it spawns myths of cosmic wolves devouring the sun. The growing season is brutally short, maybe 3 or 4 months if you're lucky. The soil is thin and rocky, demanding backbreaking labor for every bushel of grain. And always, there's the cold. The kind of cold that gets into your bones and teaches you that survival isn't a right, it's something you fight for every single day. But here's the crucial thing that most people miss about the Scandinavian environment. It wasn't just harsh, it was specifically harsh in ways that created unique adaptive pressures. In most of Europe, agricultural societies could succeed by simply claiming good land and defending it. More land meant more food, which meant more people, which meant more people, which meant more power. It was a straightforward equation that led to the development of feudal societies centered around control of agricultural territory. Scandinavia broke that equation. The best agricultural land wasn't concentrated in large valleys that could be easily controlled. It was scattered across thousands of coastal pockets, river valleys and islands, separated by water and mountains. This created a fundamentally different type of society, one where power came not from controlling the most land, but from controlling the sea routes that connected scattered communities. The people before the Vikings, the people living in this challenging environment around 500 to 600 AD, weren't yet called Vikings. That term wouldn't emerge for another 2 centuries. Instead, they were known by tribal and regional names that have mostly faded from history. The Geats of southern Sweden, whom Beowulf supposedly came from the sphere, who would give Sweden its name. The Danes, who were already consolidating power in what is now Denmark, and dozens of smaller groups scattered along Norway's shattered coastline. Recent archaeological work has completely revolutionized our understanding of these pre-Viking Scandinavian societies. The discoveries of Vendel and Roskilde in Sweden have revealed warrior graves from the 6th and 7th centuries, containing weapons, armor, and artistic objects of breathtaking sophistication. We're talking about helmets with intricate decorative plates showing complex mythological scenes, sword hilts inlaid with precious metals in patterns that required extraordinary technical skill, and ship fittings that demonstrate these people had already developed advanced maritime technology. These weren't primitive societies scratching out a bare existence. They were complex hierarchical cultures with specialized craftsmen, long-distance trade connections, and artistic traditions that produced some of the most beautiful metalwork of the early medieval period. Chemical analysis of metal objects from these graves shows that Scandinavian smiths were working with materials imported from as far away as Central Asia, indicating trade networks that already spanned thousands of miles. But the most important insight from this archaeological evidence is what it tells us about the social structure of pre-Viking Scandinavia. The distribution of grave goods, the patterns of settlement, and the architectural evidence all point to societies that were highly mobile and maritimely oriented in ways that differed fundamentally from their European neighbors. The culture of the sea. While other European societies were organizing themselves around control of land, Scandinavian communities were developing around what we might call naval aristocracies. The most prestigious members of society weren't just those who controlled the most agricultural land, though that certainly mattered. The real elite were those who commanded the finest ships and could lead successful maritime expeditions. This maritime focus shaped every aspect of Scandinavian culture. The ship itself became the ultimate symbol of status and power. More important than any building or piece of land, when a high-status Scandinavian died, they might be buried in an actual ship, surrounded by weapons, jewelry, tools, and sometimes even sacrificed slaves and animals. These ship burials, found throughout Scandinavia but especially in Norway and Sweden, reveal a culture that saw the journey to the afterlife as literally a voyage across cosmic waters. The famous Oseberg ship burial, discovered in Norway in 1904, perfectly illustrates this cultural centrality of the ship. The vessel itself is a masterpiece of naval architecture, 70 feet long and capable of carrying 30 people, decorated with elaborate carvings that transform functional ship components into works of art. But equally important are the other objects buried with it: a ceremonial wagon, several sledges, textile tools, and everyday household items. This wasn't just a grave, it was an entire mobile household, everything you'd need to establish yourself in the next world. This maritime orientation created a fundamentally different kind of society than existed elsewhere in Europe. While continental Europeans were becoming increasingly tied to specific plots of land through the development of feudal relationships, Scandinavian communities remained fluid and mobile. A family might farm in summer, fish in autumn, trade in winter, and raid in spring. People were used to travel, adapted to change, and comfortable with uncertainty in ways that would prove crucial when climatic and political changes began pushing Scandinavian society toward explosive expansion. The legal systems that developed in this environment reflected this mobility. Unlike the land-based legal codes emerging in other parts of Europe, Scandinavian law focused on personal honor and kin relationships rather than territorial control. If someone wronged you, your recourse wasn't to appeal to whoever controlled the land you were standing on, but to your family network and personal reputation. This created a highly portable system of social organization that could be transplanted anywhere Scandinavians settled. The climate catalyst around the 7th century, something crucial began to change. Northern Europe entered what climatologists call the medieval warm period, a span of several centuries when average temperatures rose by perhaps 1 or 2 degrees Celsius. That might not sound like much, but in the marginal environments of Scandinavia, it was revolutionary. The warming climate extended growing seasons, reduced sea ice, and made previously uninhabitable regions suitable for settlement. Coastal areas that had been locked in ice for much of the year became navigable for longer periods. Mountain passes that had been impassable for most of the year now opened up seasonal routes between valleys. Most importantly, agricultural yields improved dramatically, supporting a population explosion that would have profound consequences. By the late 8th century, Scandinavia was experiencing something it had never really dealt with before: overpopulation relative to available resources. This wasn't overpopulation in an absolute sense. The total population of Scandinavia was probably only a few million people, but it was overpopulation relative to the traditional economic and social structures that had organized Scandinavian society for centuries. Here's where the social dynamics get really interesting. In most agricultural societies, population pressure leads to intensification, people working their existing land harder, developing new agricultural techniques, and generally squeezing more production out of the same territory. That happened in Scandinavia too, but the scattered maritime nature of Scandinavian settlement created an alternative expansion across the sea, and this population pressure was hitting at exactly the moment when other crucial changes were transforming Scandinavian society. The rise of royal power. Throughout the 7th and 8th centuries, successful war leaders were consolidating power across larger territories. In Denmark, dynasties like the Sylings were establishing control over vast areas, transforming what had been dozens of independent chieftaincies into something approaching a unified kingdom. In Sweden, the Yngling dynasty was expanding its influence, creating a hierarchical system where local chiefs owed allegiance to more powerful overlords. In Norway, the process was more fragmented, but similar consolidation was occurring at the regional level. This political consolidation created both opportunities and problems. On one hand, larger political units could organize more extensive expeditions, coordinate more ambitious military campaigns, and negotiate with foreign powers from a position of greater strength. On the other hand, consolidation meant fewer opportunities for ambitious men to achieve status through traditional means. Think about it from the perspective of a young man coming of age in 8th century Norway. In his grandfather's generation, there had been dozens of local chiefs, each controlling small territories and competing for followers. An ambitious young warrior could offer his services to various chiefs, proving himself in local conflicts, and eventually accumulating enough wealth and reputation to become a chief himself, perhaps by clearing new land or gathering enough followers to establish his own household. But now increasingly the old independent chiefs were subordinate to regional kings, who were themselves often subordinate to even more powerful overlords. The opportunities for advancement through traditional channels were shrinking at exactly the moment when population growth was creating more young men competing for those opportunities. The answer for many became increasingly clear: look beyond Scandinavia itself, and fortunately, they had the perfect tool for doing exactly that. Chapter 2. The Dragon Ship's Engineering Revolution. The Scandinavian longship is probably the most iconic image of the Viking Age, and for good reason. This wasn't just a boat, it was a technological revolution that made Viking expansion possible in ways that no other contemporary vessel could match. But here's what most people don't understand. The longship wasn't invented suddenly in the late 8th century. It was the culmination of centuries, possibly even millennia, of accumulated shipbuilding knowledge, refined through countless incremental improvements into a design that was perfectly adapted to the specific demands of Scandinavian geography and culture. Let's break down what made these ships so revolutionary. First, construction technique. Longships were built using a method called clinker construction, where overlapping planks were riveted together to create the hull, which was then reinforced with internal frames. This differs from the cavell construction used in most medieval European ships, where planks were laid edge to edge against a pre-built frame. Why does this matter? Clinker construction created a hull that was simultaneously incredibly strong and remarkably flexible. The overlapping planks could bend and twist slightly, allowing the ship to ride over waves rather than crashing through them. This flexibility was crucial for operating in the rough seas of the North Atlantic and for the shallow coastal waters where Vikings often operated. Second, the keel. Viking shipwrights developed sophisticated techniques for creating keels from single pieces of timber, carefully selected from trees that had grown with the right natural curve. This central spine gave the ship its structural integrity and allowed it to cut through water with minimal resistance. Archaeological analysis of preserved longship keels shows an understanding of hydrodynamics that wouldn't be fully explained by scientific theory for another 1,000 years. Third, the shallow draft. A typical Viking longship might draw only 3 feet of water when fully loaded, meaning it could navigate rivers and coastal areas that were completely inaccessible to other seagoing vessels. This gave Vikings an enormous tactical advantage. They could appear suddenly on rivers deep in enemy territory, attack before any defense could be organized, and disappear back into the water system before pursuit was possible. Fourth, the propulsion system. Longships combined oars and sail in a uniquely effective way. The sail, typically made from wallcloth, could propel the ship at impressive speeds when the wind was favorable, but when the wind died, or when navigating narrow waterways, the crew could switch to oars, maintaining mobility in conditions that would leave other sailing vessels helpless. Recent experimental archaeology has provided fascinating insights into just how effective these ships were. In 2007, the Sea Stallion from Blenderlow, a full-scale reconstruction of a Viking longship, sailed from Denmark to Ireland using only traditional techniques and materials. The vessel averaged about 5-6 knots under sail, with bursts of up to 15 knots in favorable conditions, and proved remarkably seaworthy even in rough Atlantic conditions. The psychology of terror, but the longship's importance went far beyond its technical specifications. It was a weapon of psychological warfare that fundamentally changed the strategic balance of medieval Europe. Imagine you're a peasant in coastal England around 790 AD. Your entire understanding of warfare is based on armies that move slowly overland, taking days or weeks to cover significant distances. This gives you time to see them coming, time to hide valuables, time to flee to fortified positions or into the forest. War, in your experience, is something that announces itself, that you can see approaching from miles away. Then, one morning, you're working in fields near a river, and suddenly, without any warning whatsoever, dragon-headed ships appear around the bend. Within minutes, armed warriors are pouring onto the shore. They're not exhausted from a long march. They're fresh, organized, and moving with terrifying purpose. By the time you realize what's happening, it's too late to run, too late to hide, too late to do anything but pray that you'll survive. This psychological impact cannot be overstated. The longship transformed warfare from a predictable seasonal affair into something that could happen anytime, anywhere there was water. Coastal communities and river settlements lived in constant fear because there was no way to predict when the next attack might come. Medieval chroniclers understood this psychological dimension very clearly. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle entries for the early 790s don't just record what was stolen or how many were killed. They record the terror, the sense that the world had fundamentally changed, that nowhere was safe anymore. The navigational mystery. Here's one of the great mysteries of Viking expansion. How did they navigate across hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles of open ocean without compasses, accurate maps, or most of the tools we associate with medieval navigation? This question has puzzled historians and archaeologists for generations. We know that Vikings successfully crossed the North Atlantic repeatedly, reaching Iceland, Greenland, and North America with remarkable reliability. But the archaeological record has provided frustratingly little direct evidence of their navigational techniques. The written sources give us tantalizing clues. The Icelandic sagas mention navigational landmarks, stellar observation, and something called a sunstone that could supposedly locate the sun, even on cloudy days. For years, historians dismissed the sunstone as mythological. Then, in 2013, researchers discovered that certain types of crystal found in Scandinavia, specifically calcite crystals, can actually polarize light in ways that reveal the sun's position even when it's hidden by clouds. A crystal that matches this description was found in the wreck of an Elizabethan ship, suggesting this technique was actually used by medieval navigators. But beyond specific tools, Viking navigation depended on a sophisticated understanding of natural signs that was developed through centuries of maritime experience. Experienced navigators could read wave patterns to understand how they'd been affected by distant land masses. They could identify specific types of clouds that form over islands, but not over open ocean. They could use the flight patterns of seabirds to locate land, knowing that certain species only forage within specific distances from shore. Recent research has also suggested that Vikings may have used a form of latitude sailing traveling west until they reached a specific latitude, determined by the angle of the North Star, then sailing east or west along that latitude until they reached their destination. This technique wouldn't allow for pinpoint accuracy, but for reaching large land masses like Iceland or Greenland, it would be remarkably effective. The accumulation of this navigational knowledge was itself a crucial cultural achievement. This wasn't written down in the early Viking Age. It was passed orally from experienced navigators to apprentices, refined through countless voyages, and gradually built into a comprehensive system of maritime knowledge that rivaled anything available elsewhere in medieval Europe. Weapons and warfare. The ships got the Vikings to their targets, but once they arrived, they needed to fight, and fight effectively against opponents who often outnumbered them. This is where another set of technological and tactical innovations comes into play. The iconic Viking sword deserves special attention. These weren't crude hunks of sharpened iron. They were sophisticated weapons that represented the cutting edge of medieval metallurgy. Literally and figuratively, the best Viking swords were pattern welded, a technique where different types of iron and steel were forge welded together, twisted, and folded repeatedly to create blades that were both hard enough to hold an edge and flexible enough not to shatter on impact. Chemical analysis of surviving Viking swords reveals that smiths understood, probably through empirical trial and error, how to manipulate the carbon content of different parts of the blade to create exactly the properties they needed. The edge would be high carbon steel, hard and capable of taking a razor-sharp edge. The core would be lower carbon iron, more flexible and resistant to breaking. Some swords show evidence of having been made from dozens of individual pieces, welded together with such skill that the joins are nearly invisible. These weapons were expensive, time-consuming to make, and highly valued. Many were given names and passed down through generations. The sagas are full of legendary swords with names like Gram, Skoflon, and Turfing. And while those specific swords may be mythological, the practice of naming and treasuring exceptional weapons was very real. But Vikings didn't just fight with swords. They used a sophisticated array of weapons adapted to different tactical situations. Axes, both one-handed and two-handed varieties, were probably more common than swords because they were cheaper to make and equally effective in combat. Spears were ubiquitous, serving as both throwing weapons and pikes for close combat. Bows, while less emphasized in the romantic accounts, were tactically important for softening up defenders before close combat. Defensive equipment was equally sophisticated. Contrary to the popular image of half-naked berserkers, Vikings who could afford it wore extensive armor. Mail shirts made from thousands of interlocking iron rings provided excellent protection against cutting weapons. Helmets, the real ones without horns, protected the head while allowing good visibility. Shields, made from wooden planks bound together and faced with leather, could absorb tremendous impacts and were used actively in combat, not just passively for protection. But more important than any individual weapon was how Vikings used them collectively. This is where we need to completely reject the image of mindless berserkers. Viking military success depended on disciplined coordination and sophisticated tactics. The shield wall, a formation where warriors stood shoulder to shoulder with shields overlapping, was the foundation of Viking infantry tactics. This wasn't a static defensive formation, it was a flexible system that could be adapted to different situations. Against cavalry, the shield wall would brace to absorb the charge. Against other infantry, it would push forward, with the second rank using spears and axes to attack over the shields of the front rank. Vikings also developed sophisticated tactics for amphibious warfare. coordinating ship-based movements with land operations in ways that wouldn't be seen again until modern times. They understood how to use rivers as supply lines, how to establish temporary fortifications to protect their ships and plunder, and how to conduct fighting retreats back to their vessels if the situation turned against them. The famous berserkers, whose legendary fury has been so distorted in popular culture, probably did exist, but they weren't mindless savages. Recent research suggests that berserker gang, the berserk fury, may have been a real psychological state achieved through a combination of ritual preparation, possibly including the use of psychoactive substances, and intense psychological conditioning. These warriors served as shock troops, attacking first to break enemy formations, but they operated as part of coordinated battle plans, not as random engines of destruction. Chapter 3. The Storm Breaks Lindisfarne. The Raid That Changed Everything, June 8th, 793 AD. This is the date that traditionally marks the beginning of the Viking Age, when Norse raiders attacked the monastery at Lindisfarne, a small island off the northeast coast of England. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles account is brief but chilling. In this year, terrible portents appeared over Northumbria and miserably frightened the inhabitants. These were exceptional flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the air, and soon followed a great famine, and after that, in the same year, the harrying of the heathen miserably destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne by rapine and slaughter. The scholar Alcuin, who was at Charlemagne's court when news of the attack reached him, wrote a letter that captures the shock and horror that reverberated through Christian Europe. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God, like dung in the streets. But here's what's crucial to understand. Lindisfarne wasn't the first Viking raid ever. It probably wasn't even the first Viking raid on England. There's evidence of earlier Scandinavian attacks, including one in Dorset in 789, that's recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. What made Lindisfarne different was the target. Lindisfarne wasn't just any monastery. It was one of the holiest sites in northern England, founded by St. Aidan in 634 and closely associated with the Christianization of Anglo-Saxon England. Attacking it wasn't just theft, it was sacrilege of the highest order. The monks weren't soldiers or nobles who might expect to die in warfare. They were holy men who had devoted their lives to God, men who believed their sacred status made them inviolable. The Vikings, of course, didn't share this belief. To them, the monastery was a wealthy, poorly defended target full of portable valuables, the sacred vessels, gold and silver reliquaries, illuminated manuscripts with precious metal decorations. All of these were simply plunder, to be taken and either used or melted down for the raw materials. But the raid was also a demonstration of sophisticated planning. Lindisfarne is an island, connected to the mainland only by a tidal causeway that's submerged at high tide. This made it seem secure to its inhabitants, but for raiders arriving by ship, it was perfect. The island was isolated enough that no immediate help could arrive from the mainland, but close enough that the raiders could observe it, understand its rhythms, and plan their attack precisely. The raiders almost certainly didn't just stumble across Lindisfarne. They knew it was there, knew it was wealthy, and knew it was vulnerable. This suggests that Scandinavian traders or scouts had been gathering intelligence about English coastal settlements, identifying targets, and reporting back. The raid itself was the culmination of this reconnaissance, not a lucky accident. The ripple effect news of the Lindisfarne raid spread through Scandinavia like wildfire. Here was proof that the wealthy Christian lands to the south weren't just vulnerable. They were practically defenseless against the new style of warfare that longship technology made possible. Over the next few years, raids proliferated along the coasts of England, Scotland, and Ireland. In 704, the monastery at Jarrow was attacked, though this raid apparently went badly for the Vikings, with their leader killed and many ships destroyed in a storm. In 705 Vikings raided Iona, the famous monastery founded by St. Tine, Columba, marking the beginning of sustained attacks on Ireland that would continue for decades. These early raids followed a clear pattern. The targets were monasteries and other ecclesiastical sites that combined wealth with weak defenses. The raids came in late spring or summer, when weather conditions made North Sea crossings safer. The attackers struck quickly, seized portable valuables, and were gone before any organized resistance could be mounted. But calling these raids actually understates what was happening. These were sophisticated military expeditions that required extensive planning, coordination, and resources. A longship expedition to England from Norway might involve 30 to 60 men. These men needed to be fed and equipped for a journey that could last weeks or months. The ships needed to be built and maintained, requiring significant investments of time and materials, and the expedition needed to be organized under leaders who could command loyalty and distribute plunder fairly. This level of organization suggests that Viking raiding wasn't the work of random pirate bands, but rather organized expeditions backed by people with significant resources, probably local chieftains or wealthy farmers who were investing in raiding the way others might invest in trade expeditions. Ireland, the laboratory of conquest. If England was where Vikings perfected their raiding tactics, Ireland was where they learned to be conquerors and colonizers. The reasons for this difference lie in Ireland's unique political situation. In the early 9th century, Ireland was divided among dozens of small kingdoms, theoretically organized into provincial overkingdoms: Ulster, Munster, Leinster, Connacht, and Maida, but in practice constantly at war with each other. Irish kings spent far more energy fighting each other than they did preparing for external threats. Moreover, Ireland's wealth was concentrated in hundreds of monasteries scattered across the landscape, each one a tempting target for Viking raiders. The Irish chronicles, which are remarkably detailed for this period, document a rapid evolution in Viking activity. The raids of the 790s and early 800s were hit-and-run affairs, striking coastal monasteries and disappearing, but by the 820s and 830s, Vikings were penetrating deep inland along Ireland's river systems, establishing temporary bases, and beginning to overwinter rather than returning to Scandinavia after each raiding season. The establishment of the first Longfort, fortified ship camps, around 840 to 841, marked a crucial transition. These weren't just temporary anchorages but permanent fortifications designed to protect ships and plunder, control river access, and serve as bases for extended campaigns. The Long Fort at Dublin, established around 841, would become the prototype for Viking urban development and eventually grow into one of medieval Europe's most important trading centres. But here's what makes the Irish experience so important. Vikings in Ireland quickly learned to exploit local politics in ways that transformed them from external raiders into internal power brokers. Irish kings began hiring Viking warriors as mercenaries in their conflicts with each other. Vikings began making alliances with some Irish kingdoms against others. In some cases, Vikings and Irish nobles intermarried, creating hybrid dynasties that were both Scandinavian and Celtic. This political integration was accompanied by economic transformation. The Vikings brought new commercial practices to Ireland, establishing Ireland's first true urban centres. Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Cork, and Limerick all began as Viking longforts and evolved into trading cities that connected Ireland to Scandinavian and continental trade networks in ways that had never existed before. Archaeological evidence from Viking Dublin reveals a cosmopolitan commercial centre, where craftsmen worked with raw materials from across the known world: amber from the Baltic, silver from Islamic lands, silk from Byzantium, walrus ivory from the Arctic. All of this flowed through Dublin's markets. The city's population was ethnically mixed, with Scandinavians, Irish, Anglo-Saxons, and others living in close proximity, creating a hybrid culture that was neither purely Viking nor purely Irish. The Great Heathen Army. The Viking conquest of England began in earnest in 865, when the Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia. This wasn't a raiding force but a conquest army, and the difference is crucial. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes it as a great heathen army, and archaeological evidence confirms that this was a force unlike anything the Vikings had fielded before in England. This was an army equipped for sustained campaigning, with siege equipment, cavalry, and supply lines stretching back to Scandinavia. The leaders of this army are fascinating figures whose historicity has been much debated. The chronicles name Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Uber as the primary commanders, supposedly sons of the legendary Ragnar Lodbrok. Whether Ragnar was a real person or a composite of multiple historical figures remains uncertain. but his sons were definitely real and conducted one of the most successful military campaigns in medieval European history. Their strategy showed sophisticated understanding of English political weaknesses. Anglo-Saxon England in 865 was divided into 4 major kingdoms: Northumbria, East Anglia, Mercia, and Wessex. These kingdoms were often at odds with each other and had no tradition of unified action against external threats. The Great Army exploited this division ruthlessly. They would make temporary peace with one kingdom while attacking another, then shift alliances when it suited them. They used their mobility to avoid pitched battles against superior forces, instead striking at politically important targets and withdrawing before the enemy could concentrate against them. The campaign unfolded with devastating efficiency. In 866, the army seized York, Jorvik in Old Norse, the ancient Roman city that controlled northern England. In 869, they conquered East Anglia, killing King Edmund in circumstances that would make him a Christian martyr. By 870, they had overrun much of Mercia. Only Wessex, under King Aethelred and his younger brother Alfred, managed to resist. The period from 870-878 saw desperate fighting between the Great Army and the forces of Wessex. The Vikings came terrifyingly close to complete victory. In 878, a surprise winter attack drove Alfred into hiding in the marshes of Somerset, with only a small band of followers. This is the period of the famous, though probably apocryphal story of Alfred burning the cakes. But Alfred survived, rallied his forces, and won a crucial victory at the Battle of Edington in 878. This victory didn't end the Viking presence in England, but it did prevent them from conquering Wessex, leaving England divided between Anglo-Saxon and Viking control. The resulting Treaty of Wedmore formalised this division, establishing what became known as the Danelaw, the large portion of eastern and northern England, where Danish law and custom prevailed. This arrangement would persist for generations, creating a hybrid Anglo-Scandinavian society that profoundly influenced English culture, language, and political development. Chapter 4. The Eastern Connection. The Rus, Vikings in a different world. While Danish and Norwegian Vikings were raiding and conquering in Western Europe, Swedish Vikings were pursuing a completely different form of expansion to the east. This eastern expansion is less famous in popular culture but ultimately just as significant in shaping medieval European history. The Swedish Vikings who pushed eastward called themselves the Rus, a name of disputed origin that would eventually be applied to the vast territories they came to dominate. Unlike their western cousins who focused on raiding Christian monasteries, the Eastern Vikings understood from the beginning that the greatest opportunities lay in trade rather than plunder. The river systems of Eastern Europe, the Volga, the Dnieper, the Don, created natural highways connecting the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea and Caspian Sea, and thereby to the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. These civilizations were far wealthier and more sophisticated than anything in Western Europe, but they were also much more powerful, making Viking-style raiding impractical or impossible. Instead, the Rus positioned themselves as middlemen in existing trade networks, offering military protection and transportation services in exchange for a share of the profits. This required completely different skills than Western Viking expansion demanded. Instead of perfecting the art of the surprise raid, the Rus needed to learn diplomacy, commercial law, and how to navigate the complex political relationships of Eastern Europe and beyond. The founding of Russia. The traditional founding story of Russia, recorded in the primary chronicle compiled in the early 12th century, claims that Slavic tribes invited a Rus leader named Rurik to come and rule them in 862 because they couldn't govern themselves effectively. Modern historians are deeply skeptical of this convenient story, which conveniently legitimizes foreign rule. But there's clearly some truth beneath the myth. Archaeological evidence confirms that Scandinavian warrior merchants established themselves as a ruling elite over Slavic agricultural populations throughout the major river systems of Eastern Europe during the 9th century. The mechanisms of this process were probably more complex and violent than the primary chronicle suggests, but the outcome was real: the creation of hybrid Scandinavian Slavic political entities that would eventually evolve into the medieval Russian state. The key settlements in this process were Novgorod in the north and Kiev in the south. Novgorod controlled access to the river routes leading from the Baltic, while Kiev sat at the crucial point where the Dnieper River could be used to reach the Black Sea and Byzantium. The Rus leaders who controlled these cities weren't just military strongmen. They were sophisticated commercial operators who understood how to profit from their position at the intersection of multiple trade networks. Furs, honey, wax, and slaves moved south from the Baltic region toward Byzantium and the Islamic world. Silver, silk, spices, and luxury goods moved north. The Rus took their cut at every stage. The road to Constantinople, the ultimate prize for the Rus, was access to Constantinople, the wealthiest city in the medieval world, and the gateway to the riches of the Byzantine Empire and beyond. But reaching Constantinople wasn't a simple matter of sailing down the river. The Dnieper route to the Black Sea included 7 major rapids that made navigation extraordinarily difficult and dangerous. At each rapid, ships had to be either portaged around on land or carefully guided through channels, requiring intimate knowledge of local conditions. The whole process left expeditions vulnerable to attack from the nomadic peoples who controlled the steppes through which the river flowed. Byzantine sources, particularly the work De Administrando Imperio, written by Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitos in the mid-10th century, provide fascinating details about how Rus expeditions managed this journey. They traveled in flotillas for mutual protection, employed local guides, paid tribute to steppe nomads when necessary, and fought them when tribute negotiations failed, and maintained a carefully organized system of coordinating maritime and overland transport. The most dramatic moment in Rus-Byzantine relations came in 860, when a Rus fleet appeared in the Bosphorus and attacked Constantinople itself. The Byzantine Empire was the most powerful state in Christendom, and Constantinople had withstood numerous sieges over the centuries. The sudden appearance of pagan raiders from the unknown north was shocking and terrifying. Contemporary Byzantine accounts describe the psychological impact in apocalyptic terms. Patriarch Photios delivered a sermon declaring that the attack was divine punishment for Byzantine sins, and the entire population was called to prayer. The Rus withdrew without capturing the city, but they had made their point. They were a force that had to be taken seriously. The result was a series of treaties over the following decades that gave Rus merchants increasingly favorable terms for trading in Constantinople. These agreements, portions of which are preserved in the primary chronicle, show that the Rus had successfully leveraged military threat into commercial opportunity. The silver connection. The most profitable trade for the Rus was the slave trade. This is an uncomfortable fact, but it's crucial to understanding the economics of Eastern Viking expansion. The word slave itself derives from Slav, reflecting the unfortunate reality that Slavic peoples were a major source of enslaved people in the medieval period. Rus raiders and traders captured or purchased people in the north and transported them south for sale in Byzantine and Islamic markets. The scale of this trade was enormous. Contemporary Islamic sources describe markets in Central Asia where thousands of slaves were bought and sold, many of them supplied through Rus trading networks. But the most important commodity flowing north through these networks was silver, specifically Islamic silver dirhams, minted in the vast Islamic empire that stretched from Spain to Central Asia. The Islamic world had access to rich silver mines and used silver currency extensively. Northern Europe, by contrast, was relatively silver poor, making the metal extremely valuable. The quantities of Islamic silver that flowed into Scandinavia through the Rus trade networks were staggering. Over 80,000 Islamic silver coins have been found in Scandinavia, the vast majority in Sweden, and these represent only the ones that were buried and never recovered. The actual volume of trade must have been many times larger. This silver funded the continued expansion of Viking activity throughout Europe. It allowed Scandinavian leaders to maintain larger military forces, commission more ships, and support more ambitious expeditions than would have been possible through Western raiding alone. The Eastern trade wasn't just an alternative to Western expansion. It was the economic foundation that made Western expansion sustainable. Cultural transformation. The Eastern expansion exposed Vikings to cultures that were far more sophisticated than anything in contemporary Western Europe. The Byzantine Empire preserved much of the learning and technology of classical civilization. The Islamic world was experiencing a golden age of scientific, mathematical, and artistic achievement. The steppes nomads had their own sophisticated military and political traditions. Rus traders who wanted to succeed in this environment had to become cultural chameleons. They needed to learn Arabic to trade in Islamic markets, They needed to understand Byzantine court protocol to negotiate with imperial officials. They needed to navigate the complex tribal politics of the steppes to maintain their river routes. The result was a degree of cultural sophistication that distinguished the Eastern Vikings from their Western cousins. Archaeological evidence from Rus settlements shows influences from across Eurasia: Byzantine coins and silk, Islamic metalwork, Slavic pottery, steppe-style weapons, and Scandinavian jewelry all appear together, creating a material culture that reflects the cosmopolitan nature of Rus society. This cultural exchange wasn't one-directional. Scandinavian shipbuilding techniques, weaponsmithing, and artistic styles influenced the societies the Rus encountered. The famous Varangian Guard that served Byzantine emperors from the late 10th century onward was initially composed of Rus warriors and later recruited from throughout Scandinavia, bringing Norse military traditions into Byzantine service. Perhaps most significantly, the Rus eventually adopted Christianity, but they adopted it from Byzantium rather than Rome. Bringing Orthodox Christianity to Russia, the conversion of Vladimir the Great of Kiev in 988 was a calculated political decision designed to strengthen ties with Byzantium, but it had profound long-term consequences, establishing the religious and cultural orientation toward the East that would characterize Russian civilization for centuries. Chapter 5. The Atlantic Frontier. The discovery of Iceland. While the Eastern Vikings were building their river empires, the Western Vikings were pushing into the Atlantic, driven by the same combination of population pressure, political consolidation, and simple restless curiosity that had motivated earlier expansions. Iceland was probably known to Irish monks before the Vikings arrived. There are references in Irish sources to an island called Thule, where monks established hermitages seeking isolation for religious contemplation, but it was the Vikings who colonized Iceland on a large scale, beginning around 870 AD. The traditional account, preserved in the Landnámabók Book of Settlements, compiled in the 12th century, names Ingólfur Arnarsson as the first permanent settler, establishing his farm at Reykjavik, Smoky Bay, named for geothermal steam, around 874. But archaeological evidence suggests Norse settlement may have begun slightly earlier, and the process was more gradual and complex than the neat founding stories suggest. What made Iceland attractive for settlement wasn't just land availability, though that was certainly important. Iceland also offered something unique: the opportunity to establish a completely new society from scratch, without having to accommodate existing populations or adapt to pre-existing political structures. The settlement period, conventionally dated to 817-30, saw a massive migration from Norway and the Norse Atlantic Islands. The Landnámabók records over 400 original settlers and their families, giving us an unusually detailed picture of this colonization process. These weren't desperate refugees, but relatively wealthy farmers who could afford to transport their families, livestock, and household goods across the North Atlantic, suggesting this was a planned, organized colonization rather than a chaotic flight. The Icelandic Commonwealth, the political system that emerged in Iceland, was unlike anything else in medieval Europe. Instead of a monarchy or feudal hierarchy, Iceland developed what historians call a commonwealth or free state, governed by a complex system of chieftaincies and assemblies that balanced individual freedom with collective governance. The foundation of this system was the Althing, established around 930, an annual assembly where free farmers gathered to make laws, settle disputes, and coordinate collective action. This wasn't primitive democracy in the modern sense. There were clear status hierarchies and not everyone had equal voice. But it was a remarkably sophisticated system of republican governance. The Althing met for 2 weeks each summer at Thingvellir, a dramatic rift valley in southwestern Iceland. The location was chosen for its central position and probably also for its dramatic geography, which created a natural amphitheatre suitable for large gatherings. At its height, the Althing might attract over 1,000 participants, along with their families and servants, making it a major social event as well as a political one. The legal system that developed around the Althing was equally innovative. Instead of royal justice imposed from above, Iceland developed a complex system of compensation and arbitration. Violence was treated not as a crime against the state, since there was no state, but as an injury to specific individuals or families that required compensation. This created a sophisticated legal culture where disputes were resolved through negotiation, arbitration, and carefully calibrated compensation payments rather than through royal decree or trial by combat. The system wasn't always effective. Blood feuds did occur, and they could escalate catastrophically, but it represented a genuine alternative to the monarchical systems developing elsewhere in medieval Europe. Greenland, the edge of the world. Greenland was discovered around 982 by Eric the Red, one of the most colourful figures in Viking history. Eric, Old Norse Erik Raude, had been exiled from Norway for killing a man, moved to Iceland, and then been exiled from Iceland for killing more men in a local feud. His voyage to Greenland was partly exploration and partly exile, looking for a place to start over where his violent past wouldn't follow him. The name Greenland was Eric's marketing genius at work. The coastal areas where Norse settlement was possible did have relatively green valleys suitable for grazing, especially during the medieval warm period when temperatures were higher than they are today. But calling it Greenland was clearly intended to attract settlers to what was obviously a more challenging environment than Iceland. Eric's marketing worked. When he returned to Iceland around 985 to recruit settlers, he convinced hundreds of people to join him. The saga accounts claim that 25 ships set out, though only 14 arrived, the others either turning back or being lost at sea. This gives some sense of the risks involved in these Atlantic crossings. The Greenland colonies that Eric established were remarkably successful for several centuries. At their height, they may have numbered 3,007 to 5,007 people living in two main settlements. The eastern settlement, a misnomer, it was actually on the southwestern coast, near modern Qaqortoq, and the western settlement further up the western coast, near modern Nuuk. Archaeological excavations of Norse Greenland sites reveal communities that maintained Scandinavian cultural identity while adapting to an environment utterly unlike anywhere else Vikings had settled. The farms were built in Scandinavian style but adapted to local conditions. The economy combined traditional livestock farming, mainly sheep and goats. Cattle were difficult in Greenland's climate. With hunting seals, whales, walrus and caribou, the most important export from Greenland was walrus ivory, which was prized in European markets before elephant ivory from Africa became readily available. Greenlanders also exported polar bear pelts, walrus hide rope, valued for ship's rigging, and live falcons which were prized for hunting. These exotic goods gave Greenland access to European markets despite its remote location. But Greenland was always marginal, both geographically and economically. It was the furthest extension of European civilization, dependent on maintaining maritime contact with Iceland and Norway for goods that couldn't be produced locally: iron, timber, and grain. When conditions changed, as we'll see later, Greenland's colonies would prove tragically vulnerable. Vinland, the Viking discovery of America. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailed west from Greenland and became the first European to set foot in North America, roughly 500 years before Columbus. This isn't Viking propaganda or nationalist myth-making, it's historical fact, confirmed by archaeology, specifically the excavation of Norse remains at Landsorgs Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada. This site, discovered in 1960 and excavated over the following decades, contains unmistakable evidence of Norse presence. Architectural techniques identical to those in Iceland and Greenland. Iron nails of Norse type, a bronze cloak pin, and a spindle haul for spinning wool. The sagas provide our written accounts of these voyages. The saga of the Greenlanders and Eric the Red saga both describe multiple expeditions to lands west of Greenland, which they called Helluland, Stone Slab Land, probably Baffin Island, Markland, Forest Land, probably Labrador, and Vinland, Wineland or possibly Meadowland, the southern portion of their exploration probably including Newfoundland and possibly points further south. The exact location of Vinland has been debated for centuries. Landsorgs Meadows is definitely Norse and definitely in North America, but it seems to have been a temporary base rather than a permanent settlement, and the saga descriptions of Vinland suggest a location somewhat further south with a milder climate. It's possible that Vinland describes a region rather than a single site, and that Vikings explored considerable stretches of the North American coast. What's clear from the sagas is that Vikings encountered indigenous peoples, whom they called Skraelings, a term of uncertain meaning but definitely not flattering. The encounters were mixed, initially involving some trade. The sagas describe Native Americans trading furs for milk products, but eventually turning violent. The sagas describe battles between Vikings and Skraelings, and it's these conflicts that apparently convinced the Vikings to abandon attempts at permanent settlement. Unlike in Iceland and Greenland, where they found empty land, or in England and Ireland, where they could use superior military technology to overcome resistance, in North America they faced indigenous populations who were both numerous and militarily capable. There's also the economic question. Vinland was rich in timber and game, but so was Scandinavia. There was no obvious economic incentive for permanent settlement that would justify the enormous difficulties of maintaining supply lines across the North Atlantic. The Greenland colonies barely survived with support from Iceland and Norway. A Vinland colony would have been even more tenuous. So Vikings visited North America, probably established temporary bases for timber gathering and exploration, but didn't establish permanent colonies. This doesn't diminish the achievement crossing the Atlantic in open boats and establishing communities, however temporary, on another continent, required extraordinary seamanship and courage. But it does explain why Viking America remained a footnote rather than becoming a major chapter in the history. Chapter 6. The Transformation of Viking Society. Christianization. The ideological revolution. The conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity was one of the most profound transformations in Viking history, and it happened remarkably quickly. In 800, Scandinavia was entirely pagan, with a complex religious system centered on gods like Odin, Thor, and Frey. By 1100, it was nominally Christian, with churches, monasteries, and an ecclesiastical hierarchy integrated into the broader European Christian community. This transformation wasn't simple or straightforward. It involved centuries of gradual change, periodic reversals, violent conflicts, and complex motivations that had as much to do with politics and international relations as with genuine religious conviction. The process began with Vikings who encountered Christianity through their raids and settlements in Christian lands. Some Viking leaders adopted Christianity for practical reasons. It made negotiations with Christian rulers easier. It could legitimize their rule over Christian subjects, and it integrated them into the broader European political system. The famous conversion of Rollo, the Viking leader who established himself in what became Normandy, exemplifies this pragmatic approach. When Rollo agreed to accept baptism as part of his treaty with the French king Charles the Simple in 911, he was making a political calculation, not experiencing a spiritual revelation. Christianity was the price of legitimacy and recognition, but the systematic conversion of Scandinavia itself began in the late 10th century with kings who saw Christianity as a tool for centralizing their power. Harald Bluetooth of Denmark, whose conversion around 960 we mentioned earlier, explicitly linked his Christianization of Denmark to his political unification of the kingdom. The Jelling stone which Harald erected around 965 makes this connection explicit with its famous runic inscription. King Harald ordered this monument made in memory of Gorm his father and in memory of Dyra his mother, that Harald who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. The stone also features Christian imagery, a depiction of Christ, alongside traditional Nordic decorative elements, perfectly capturing the cultural transition it represents. The conversion of Norway was more violent and contested. Olaf Tryggvason, R95-1000, and Olaf Haraldsson, Lafdauntek, and Olaf Harald, Psalm, later Saint Olaf Ardar, Evi 15-28, both pursued aggressive Christianization policies that included destroying pagan temples, executing or exiling those who resisted conversion, and using Christianity as an ideological foundation for royal authority. The sagas describe Olaf Tryggvason using extreme methods to enforce conversion, threatening to execute resistors, taking hostages from prominent pagan families, and personally destroying sacred sites. These accounts are probably exaggerated, but they reflect the reality that Christianization was often imposed from above through coercion rather than arising organically from popular religious conviction. Sweden converted later and more gradually. Archaeological evidence suggests that pagan practices persisted in Sweden into the 12th century, particularly in the Uppsala region, which was a major pagan religious center. The famous temple at Uppsala, described in later sources as a center for pagan worship including human sacrifice, apparently continued functioning long after Denmark and Norway had officially converted. The integration into Christian Europe. Christianization wasn't just about religion, it represented the integration of Scandinavia into the broader European political, economic, and cultural system. Christian kingdoms could negotiate as equals with other Christian rulers, enter into marriage alliances, participate in church councils, and generally function as part of the European state system in ways that pagan kingdoms could not. The establishment of church hierarchy in Scandinavia created new administrative structures that actually supported royal centralization. Bishops and priests, educated and often from aristocratic families, became important royal administrators. Churches and monasteries, established with royal support, became centers of literacy and learning. The Church's insistence on written law and documentation supported the development of more sophisticated governmental systems. The adoption of Christianity also opened up new cultural possibilities. Christian missionaries brought literacy, not just for religious texts but for law codes, administrative records, and eventually vernacular literature. The great flowering of Icelandic literature in the 12th and 13th centuries, including the sagas and Eddic poetry that preserve so much of our knowledge about the Viking Age, was written by Christian authors educated in the literary traditions introduced by the Church. But Christianization also represented the loss of much traditional culture. The oral poetry that had preserved pre-Christian mythology largely disappeared, except for what Christian authors chose to record. Pagan religious practices that had connected Scandinavians to their landscape and their ancestors were suppressed. Traditional forms of social organization based on kinship and personal loyalty were gradually replaced by more hierarchical systems based on territorial control and Christian concepts of authority. The development of Scandinavian kingdoms. The political transformation of Scandinavia from a collection of tribal chieftaincies to centralized monarchies was closely connected to Christianization, but also reflected broader European trends toward more sophisticated governmental systems. In Denmark, this process began earliest and proceeded most smoothly. The Jelling dynasty, particularly Harald Bluetooth and his successors, successfully established control over what had been a patchwork of independent chieftaincies and petty kingdoms. The great wing fortresses built in Denmark during Harald's reign, massive circular fortifications at sites like Trelleborg and Fikart, demonstrate the organizational capacity and territorial control that the Danish monarchy had achieved by the late 10th century. Norway's unification was more contested and took longer to complete. Harald Fairhair is traditionally credited with unifying Norway in the late 9th century, but this unification was probably more limited than later sources claim, and it certainly didn't last. Effective, permanent unification came later, in the 11th century, particularly under Saint Olaf and his successors. Sweden's unification came even later, not really being completed until the 13th century. The Swedish kingdom developed around the Svar tribe in the Uppsala region, gradually extending its control over other tribal groups and regional kingdoms. But this process was slower and less centralized than in Denmark or Norway. This variation in timing and process reflects different local conditions. Denmark, with its more compact territory and agricultural wealth, was easier to unify and control. Norway, with its fragmented geography of isolated valleys and scattered islands, was much harder to govern from a single center. Sweden was divided between the agricultural south and the vast forests and mining regions of the north, with different economic bases that made unified control challenging. But across all of Scandinavia, the trend was clearly toward larger, more centralized political units, organized around royal dynasties that claimed hereditary right to rule, collected taxes, administered justice, and increasingly monopolized legitimate violence. This represented a fundamental shift from the more fluid, mobile, and egalitarian, at least among freemen, society of the early Viking Age. The military revolution, the military organization that had made Viking expansion possible, was also transformed during this period. The opportunistic raiding bands of the early Viking Age gave way to more organized military structures under royal control. The famous Ledang system, recorded in later law codes but probably established in the 11th century, required free men to provide ships, crews, and equipment for royal military expeditions. This created standing naval forces that could be mobilized quickly for defensive or offensive purposes. Denmark, with its relatively wealthy and densely populated territory, could potentially mobilize enormous forces through the Lidang, probably several hundred ships carrying thousands of warriors. But the Lidang also represented a shift in the nature of military service. Instead of voluntary expeditions led by independent chieftains distributing plunder to their followers, military service was becoming an obligation owed to the king in exchange for the right to own land and participate in the political system. The weapons and tactics were also evolving. The traditional Viking emphasis on infantry warfare with shield walls and individual heroic combat was being supplemented by cavalry, siege warfare, and more sophisticated logistics. Viking armies of the 11th century looked and fought more like other contemporary European forces and less like the distinctive raiding bands of the early Viking Age. This military evolution is perfectly captured by comparing the Great Heathen Army's campaigns in England in the 860s-870s with Cnut the Great's conquest of England in Heaven 1-5 to Ness 16. Both were successful Viking invasions of England, separated by about 150 years, but they operated in completely different ways. The Great Heathen Army was essentially a large raiding band that used mobility, surprise, and exploitation of English political divisions to conquer territory without having the numerical superiority for conventional warfare. Cnut's invasion, by contrast, was a massive military operation backed by the resources of the entire Danish kingdom, featuring multiple fleets, extensive logistics, and the ability to fight and win large-scale conventional battles. The Battle of Assundan in 1016, where Cnut defeated the English king Edmund Ironside, involved thousands of soldiers on each side, and was decided by conventional infantry combat, not by Viking tactical innovation. Cnut won not because he was using revolutionary Viking tactics, but because he commanded a larger, better organized army backed by the resources of a centralized kingdom. Chapter 7. The Height of Viking Power. The North Sea Empire. Cnut the Great, who ruled England from 1816-35 and simultaneously controlled Denmark and Norway, created what historians call the North Sea Empire, the most extensive political unification of the region in the medieval period, and probably the high point of Viking political achievement. Cnut's rise to power shows how far Viking leaders had come from the raiders of the early Viking Age. He inherited his position as King of Denmark from his father Swene Forkbeard, who had himself been King of Denmark and briefly King of England. Cnut wasn't a landless adventurer seeking his fortune. He was a crown prince commanding the resources of an established kingdom. His conquest of England was methodical and well-planned. He invaded in 1514 with a large fleet and army, spent 2 years in systematic campaigning that gradually reduced English resistance, and finally achieved victory after the Battle of Assundan and the death of his rival Edmund Ironside in 1601. What Cnut did after his conquest shows sophisticated political sense. He could have ruled England as a foreign conqueror backed purely by Danish military might, but instead, he worked to integrate English and Danish elites into a unified governing system. He married Emma of Normandy, widow of the previous English king, Ethelred the Unready, connecting himself to the English royal line. He retained many English nobles and positions of authority. He patronized the English church extensively, positioning himself as a Christian king rather than a pagan conqueror. His law code, which survives in later copies, shows an attempt to blend English and Scandinavian legal traditions. He maintained the traditional English system of shires and ealdormen, while also granting large territories to Danish earls who formed a new aristocratic layer. He was, in short, trying to create a genuinely unified kingdom, not just a military occupation. Control of Norway, acquired around 1028, was more tentative and ultimately didn't survive his death. But at its height, his empire controlled both sides of the North Sea, the Danish straits that connected the Baltic to the Atlantic, and key positions in the Irish Sea, giving him potential control over the most important maritime trade routes in northern Europe. But the North Sea Empire didn't survive Cnut's death in 1035. His sons divided the inheritance and proved unable to maintain their father's achievement. Within 7 years, the empire had fragmented. Harald Harefoot ruled England briefly, then Magnus the Good of Norway seized Denmark, then Edward the Confessor restored the Old English royal line in England. The unified North Sea Empire proved to be a personal achievement of Kant rather than a stable political structure. The Normans, Vikings transformed, while Scandinavia itself was evolving into medieval kingdoms. Viking settlers in other regions were undergoing their own transformations. The most consequential of these transformations occurred in Normandy. The Vikings, who settled in northwestern France around 911 under Rollo's leadership, adopted French language, French culture, and French military technology with remarkable speed. Within 2 generations, they were essentially French nobles who happened to have Scandinavian ancestry. Within 4 generations, they probably didn't even speak Norse anymore. But they retained certain characteristics that seemed distinctively Scandinavian: adaptability, military innovation, administrative sophistication, and an aggressive expansionist energy. These Normanized Vikings would go on to conquer England in 1066, southern Italy and Sicily in the 11th century, and establish Crusader states in the Holy Land. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 is supremely ironic. England, which had been conquered by Vikings, the Danes under Canute, just 50 years earlier, was conquered again by Normans who were themselves descended from Vikings. William the Conqueror was the great-great-great-grandson of Rollo, the Viking chieftain who had established Norman power in the first place. But William's invasion and the Danish-Norwegian invasion, led by Harald Hardrada that same year, which failed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, illustrate how different Viking power had become by the mid-11th century. Both invasions were massive military operations backed by extensive resources and organized along feudal lines. Both featured heavily armored cavalry alongside traditional infantry. Both were led by rulers who claimed legitimate hereditary rights to the English throne, not by opportunistic raiders seeking plunder. The famous Bayeux Tapestry, which depicts William's conquest, shows armies that are technologically and organizationally indistinguishable from each other. The Normans and English both fight with similar weapons, wear similar armor, and use similar tactics, the things that had made Viking warfare distinctive in the early Viking Age. Superior ships, surprise attacks, mobility had been either copied by their enemies or had become irrelevant to the new style of warfare that dominated 11th century Europe, the Varangian Guard. The Varangian Guard represents another fascinating transformation of Viking military culture. This was an elite unit of the Byzantine army, composed initially of Rus Vikings and later recruited more broadly from Scandinavia, serving as the personal bodyguard of Byzantine emperors from the late 10th through the 14th century. The Varangians were famous for their loyalty. They were foreigners with no ties to Byzantine political factions, making them ideal bodyguards. Their ferocity in battle, and their distinctive weapons, particularly the long 2-handed axes that became their signature. Byzantine sources describe them with a mixture of respect and bemusement. These huge northern barbarians who drank too much and fought like madmen, but could be absolutely trusted to defend the emperor's person. Service in the Varangian Guard became a rite of passage for ambitious young Scandinavians in the 11th century. If you wanted to prove yourself, gain wealth, and earn a reputation, you traveled to Constantinople and joined the Guard. Many returned home wealthy and famous. Some stayed and integrated into Byzantine society. A few even rose to significant positions in the Byzantine military hierarchy. Harald Hardrada, who would later become King of Norway and died trying to conquer England in 1066, served in the Varangian Guard in his youth. The saga accounts, which are certainly exaggerated but probably contain kernels of truth, describe him fighting in Sicily, Bulgaria, and the Holy Land, accumulating enormous wealth and having a romantic entanglement with a Byzantine princess. Whether the details are true, it's clear that Harold's Byzantine service was formative, exposing him to a level of military sophistication and political complexity that informed his later career. The Varangians also left physical evidence of their presence. Runic inscriptions carved by Varangian guards have been found in Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, where bored guardsmen apparently carved their names on marble railings during long services. These graffiti, which say things like Halfdan carved these runes, provide touching evidence of individual Vikings far from home, maintaining their cultural identity in the heart of the Byzantine Empire. Chapter 8. Twilight and Transformation. The End of the Viking Age. The Viking Age doesn't have a neat end date. Different historians propose different markers. The Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, when Harald Hardrada died trying to conquer England, is a popular choice. The establishment of Christian monarchies throughout Scandinavia by around 1100 is another. The end of the Greenland colonies in the 15th century could be seen as the final extinction of Viking culture in its last outpost, but really, the Viking Age didn't end so much as it transformed into something else. The Vikings didn't disappear, they became medieval Scandinavians, northern Europeans who were culturally Christian, politically organized into kingdoms, and integrated into the broader European system. The transformation happened for multiple intersecting reasons. First, the easy targets were gone. By the 11th century, European societies had learned to defend themselves against Viking tactics, fortified towns, professional armies, naval forces. All of these made raiding far less profitable and far more dangerous than it had been in the 9th century. Second, Christianization connected Scandinavia to European culture in ways that made the old pagan raiding culture ideologically unacceptable. Christian kings couldn't openly support raids on other Christian kingdoms without facing ecclesiastical censure. Third, political consolidation redirected aggressive energies inward. Ambitious young men who might once have gone raiding could now pursue advancement in royal courts, compete for positions in church hierarchy, or participate in the new commercial opportunities that trade networks provided. Fourth, the climate was changing again. The medieval warm period peaked around 1000 to 1200, then began cooling. This made the marginal settlements, particularly Greenland, increasingly difficult to sustain and probably reduced overall population pressure in Scandinavia. The fate of the Greenland colonies. The Greenland colonies deserve special attention because their eventual failure represents the tragic end of the furthest reach of Viking expansion. The Norse Greenlanders persisted for about 500 years, from the late 10th century until sometime in the 15th century, but they were always marginal, dependent on maintaining contact with Iceland and Norway for essential supplies, particularly iron and timber. As the climate cooled during the late medieval period, the beginning of the Little Ice Age, conditions in Greenland became increasingly harsh. The growing season shortened. Sea ice increased, making navigation more difficult, and the walrus populations that provided Greenland's main export commodity became harder to access. At the same time, Greenland's connection to Europe was weakening. The establishment of direct trade routes to Africa meant that elephant ivory replaced walrus ivory in European markets, eliminating Greenland's main trade good. Political changes in Scandinavia meant that maintaining the Greenland connection became less of a priority for Norwegian rulers. Archaeological evidence from late Norse Greenland sites is heartbreaking. The inhabitants were clearly struggling, their diet shifting to rely more heavily on seals and fish as their livestock herds shrank. Their buildings became smaller and cruder as timber became scarce. Imported goods virtually disappeared, indicating the breakdown of trade connections. The last written record from Norse Greenland is a marriage record from 1408. At some point after that, the settlements died out. Whether the last inhabitants died, abandoned the settlements to try their luck elsewhere, or were assimilated into Inuit populations remains uncertain. When European contact was re-established in the 18th century, the Norse Greenlanders were gone, their farms ruins, their fate a mystery. The Greenland tragedy represents the ultimate limit of Viking expansion. These were people with all the traditional Viking characteristics: adaptability, toughness, willingness to endure hardship, but they were trying to maintain a European farming lifestyle in an environment that couldn't sustain it, dependent on supply lines that proved too tenuous to maintain long-term. The persistence of Viking culture. But while political and religious transformation ended the Viking Age proper, Viking cultural influence persisted in numerous ways. Language is the most obvious legacy. English contains thousands of words borrowed from Old Norse, particularly in everyday vocabulary: sky, egg, window, husband, knife, law, ugly, wronging, take, get, and hundreds more. Place names throughout England, Ireland, Scotland, and the Atlantic Islands preserve Norse origins. Any place ending in by farm, settlement, thorp, village, thwaite, clearing, or wick, bay, is almost certainly Norse in origin. Legal systems also preserve Viking influence. The English jury system has possible roots in Scandinavian legal traditions. Iceland's Althing, though it ceased functioning as an independent legislature when Iceland came under Norwegian control in 1262, was reconstituted in modern times and claims continuous existence since 930, making it arguably the world's oldest surviving parliament. Genetic studies show the extent of Viking settlement and integration. In parts of England, particularly in the old Danelaw territories, a significant percentage of the population shows Scandinavian genetic ancestry. Iceland's population is genetically about 60% Norwegian and 40% Celtic, mainly Irish, reflecting the settlement pattern. Orkney and Shetland are more Scandinavian than Scottish in genetic terms. Perhaps most importantly, the Viking Age created enduring cultural memories that shaped how Northern Europeans understood themselves. The Icelandic sagas, written down in the 13th century but preserving memories of the Viking Age, became foundational texts for Scandinavian identity. The romantic nationalism of the 19th century drew heavily on Viking imagery to construct national identities for modern Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. The Viking legacy in the modern world. The Viking influence on the modern world extends far beyond language, genetics, and cultural memory. Viking expansion created structures and connections that shaped the medieval world and thereby influenced everything that followed. The trading networks that Vikings established, particularly the eastern routes connecting Scandinavia to Byzantium and the Islamic world, became foundations for later commercial development. The cities that began as Viking trading posts, Dublin, York, Kiev, Novgorod, became major medieval centers that remain important today. The Viking integration of the North Atlantic, establishing connections between Iceland, Greenland, and briefly North America, represented the first time these regions had been brought into contact with European civilization. While the Greenland and Vinland settlements ultimately failed, they demonstrated that Atlantic crossings were possible, providing knowledge and possibly inspiration for later exploration. The Norman expansion, carried out by Normanized Vikings, shaped medieval Europe profoundly. The Norman Kingdom of Sicily became one of the most sophisticated and multicultural states in medieval Europe, blending Norman, Italian, Byzantine, and Islamic influences. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 fundamentally altered English society, language, and culture, with effects that persist to this day. The Viking model of mobile, adaptable expansion influenced later European colonial efforts. The combination of military capability, commercial acumen, and cultural flexibility that characterized successful Viking expansion reappears in later Portuguese, Dutch, and English colonial enterprises. Chapter 9. The Archaeological Revolution. What we're still discovering. Our understanding of the Vikings has been revolutionized over the last few decades by archaeological discoveries and new analytical techniques. Many of the definitive statements made about Vikings even 20 or 30 years ago have had to be revised or completely abandoned based on new evidence. DNA analysis has been particularly revolutionary. For example, we now know that the simple picture of Vikings as Scandinavian raiders has to be complicated. DNA evidence from Viking burial sites throughout Europe shows much more genetic diversity than was previously assumed. Viking identities were apparently adopted by people from various backgrounds who participated in Viking culture, not just ethnic Scandinavians. A 2020 study published in Nature analyzed 442 ancient human genomes from across Europe and Greenland, spanning the Viking Age. The results showed that Viking raiding parties included people with no Scandinavian ancestry. There was significant genetic flow in all directions, Scandinavians settling abroad, but also non-Scandinavians coming to Scandinavia. The population of Scandinavia itself was more genetically diverse during the Viking Age than previously thought. Isotope analysis of teeth and bones can reveal where individuals grew up and what they ate, providing insights into migration and diet. These studies have shown that Viking populations were highly mobile, with individuals born in Scandinavia dying in Britain or vice versa, and with diets that varied considerably based on local resources and trade connections. The discovery of the Salmi ship burials in Estonia in 2008-2011 provided extraordinary new evidence about Viking military organization. These were two ships filled with dead warriors, apparently killed in battle around 750 AD, before the traditional start of the Viking Age. The remains included high-status warriors buried with elaborate weapons and gaming pieces. suggesting this was an elite military expedition that came to a bad end. What makes this discovery so significant is the timing. These pre-Viking Age ship burials show that the Scandinavian cultural patterns we associate with Vikings, elaborate weapon burials, ship burials, mobile military expeditions, were already established before the Lindisfarne raid in 793. This supports the idea that what changed in the late 8th century wasn't Scandinavian society itself, but rather their decision to direct their capabilities toward raiding Christian Europe. Metal detector finds have revolutionized our understanding of Viking Age trade and settlement. In England, the Portable Antiquity Scheme has recorded thousands of Viking Age objects found by metal detectorists, revealing patterns of settlement and activity that weren't visible from traditional archaeological excavation alone. Similar programs in Scandinavia have produced comparable results. The Galloway Hoard, discovered in Scotland in 2014, is one of the most important Viking Age silver hoards ever found. It includes over 100 objects, silver armbands, ingots, brooches, and a unique gold bird-shaped pin, along with textiles and other organic materials preserved by the silver. Analysis is still ongoing, but it's already revealed new information about Viking trade networks, metalworking techniques, and the deposition of wealth. Rewriting what we knew. Perhaps most revolutionary has been the discovery that much of what everyone knew about Vikings was wrong. The horned helmets, as we mentioned earlier, never existed in the Viking Age. This is a 19th century invention. The actual helmets Vikings wore were simpler, more practical designs, often with face guards but never with horns, which would be tactically idiotic in combat. The image of Vikings as exclusively male warriors has also had to be revised. While Viking raiding bands and armies were certainly male-dominated, there's increasing evidence of women participating in Viking expansion as settlers, traders, and possibly even occasionally as warriors. The famous Birka warrior, a high-status Viking Age burial from Sweden that contained a full set of weapons and was interpreted as elite male warrior, was revealed through DNA testing in 2017 to actually be biologically female. This caused enormous controversy, with many archaeologists arguing that it must be misidentification or contamination. But follow-up studies confirmed the results, forcing reconsideration of assumptions about gender roles in Viking society. This doesn't mean that female warriors were common, or that Viking society was gender egalitarian in modern terms. But it does suggest that the reality was more complex and varied than the simple picture of male warriors and stay-at-home women. The image of Vikings as dirty, uncivilized barbarians has been thoroughly demolished. Archaeological evidence shows that Vikings were actually quite fastidious about personal hygiene by medieval standards. They bathed regularly, much more so than contemporary Christian Europeans, combed and styled their hair, and cared about their appearance. Burial goods regularly include combs, tweezers, razors, and ear cleaners. Contemporary Arab accounts describe Scandinavian traders as vain about their appearance. The idea that Vikings were primarily raiders has also been revised. While raiding was certainly important, particularly in the early Viking Age, trade and peaceful settlement were probably always more significant economically. The Vikings were fundamentally maritime traders who sometimes raided but more often negotiated, bargained, and integrated themselves into local economies. The digital revolution. New technologies are opening up new possibilities for Viking archaeology. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, surveys can reveal archaeological features hidden by vegetation, allowing archaeologists to identify Viking Age settlements without excavation. Ground-penetrating radar can locate buried structures and graves without digging. Satellite imagery can identify patterns visible from space, but not from ground level. These technologies have led to discoveries that would have been impossible with traditional methods. The massive Viking fortress discovered at Borgring in Denmark in 2014 was identified through LiDAR survey. It's one of the ring fortresses built during Harald Bluetooth's reign, but its existence was completely unknown until the LiDAR revealed its distinctive circular shape beneath cultivated fields. 3D scanning and photogrammetry allow incredibly detailed recording of artifacts and sites, creating digital records that can be studied, shared, and analyzed without risking damage to the originals. The British Museum has 3D scanned many of its Viking Age objects, making them available for study by researchers worldwide. database compilation of all known Viking Age artifacts, sites and finds, is revealing patterns that weren't visible when information was scattered across hundreds of individual excavation reports and museum collections. The ability to query databases containing thousands of objects allows statistical analysis that can identify trends in trade, settlement, and material culture across the entire Viking world. Chapter 10. Understanding the Vikings. Why the Vikings matter. After spending this much time examining Viking history, it's worth stepping back to ask, why should we care? What makes the Vikings significant beyond being the subject of entertaining stories and impressive archaeological sites? I'd argue that the Vikings matter for several interconnected reasons. First, they fundamentally shaped the medieval world in ways that persist to this day. The kingdoms they established, the cities they founded, the trade routes they opened, and the cultural exchanges they facilitated all had lasting impacts. England was permanently changed by Viking settlement and conquest. Russia was literally created by Viking expansion. The North Atlantic world was opened by Viking exploration. These weren't minor footnotes. They were transformative historical developments. Second, they represent a remarkable case study in rapid cultural adaptation and evolution. In less than 3 centuries, Viking society transformed from tribal agricultural communities into a civilization that spanned 4 continents, from opportunistic raiders into the founders of kingdoms, from illiterate pagans into Christian societies producing sophisticated literature. This transformation happened faster and more completely than almost any other comparable example in history, and understanding how and why it happened provides insights into the nature of cultural change itself. Third, they challenge our assumptions about the medieval period and about barbarian societies generally. The Vikings weren't primitive savages. They were sophisticated navigators, innovative shipbuilders, skilled craftsmen, adaptable colonizers, and capable administrators. Their society, while certainly violent by modern standards, was also remarkably egalitarian in some ways, with legal systems that emphasized compensation over punishment and political structures that balanced individual freedom with collective governance. Fourth, they demonstrate the power of technological innovation. The longship, the technological foundation of Viking expansion, wasn't a dramatic breakthrough invention but rather the culmination of centuries of incremental improvement. But when combined with the right social organization and strategic vision, it became a transformative technology that changed the medieval world. This pattern, incremental technological improvement creating sudden strategic opportunity, reappears throughout history. Fifth, they illustrate the complex relationship between climate, resources, political organization, and cultural dynamics. Viking expansion was driven by a complex combination of climatic warming, population pressure, political consolidation, and cultural values that celebrated exploration and risk-taking. Understanding this combination helps us understand human societies more generally. Separating myth from reality. The Vikings have been mythologized almost from the moment the Viking Age ended. Medieval Christian writers portrayed them as God's punishment for sin, emphasizing their violence and paganism while downplaying their sophistication. Romantic nationalists in the 19th century portrayed them as noble savages embodying natural virtue and martial prowess. Modern popular culture portrays them as everything from barbaric raiders to proto-democratic explorers. Depending on what narrative is being constructed, the reality, as we've seen, is more complex and more interesting than any of these simplified images. Vikings were sophisticated maritime traders who sometimes raided but more often traded, adaptable colonizers who could thrive in environments from the steppes of Russia to the ice fields of Greenland, innovative shipbuilders and navigators who explored further than any Europeans before them, complex societies with sophisticated legal systems, artistic traditions, and political organizations, gradually Christianizing and centralizing, transforming from tribal structures to medieval kingdoms, remarkably egalitarian in some ways, particularly regarding free men's rights, but rigidly hierarchical in others, particularly regarding slavery, violent by modern standards but not exceptionally so by medieval standards, literate through runes, but primarily oral in their culture until Christianization brought Latin literacy, religiously pagan but increasingly influenced by Christianity, and willing to be pragmatic about religious identity. The most important thing to understand is that Viking wasn't an ethnic identity, but rather an activity or identity that people could adopt. You went, I Viking, on raid expedition. You didn't belong to a Viking race. This fluidity of Viking identity helps explain both the rapid expansion of Viking activity and its equally rapid transformation into something else. The Viking Age in perspective. It's worth putting the Viking Age in historical perspective. The entire period from the Lindisfarne raid in 793 to the conventional end of the Viking Age, around 1066–1100, is only about 300 years. That's roughly the same span as from the founding of Jamestown to the present day, or from the invention of the printing press to the French Revolution. Within that relatively brief period, Vikings explored and settled Iceland, discovered and colonized Greenland, reached North America, established the first Russian states, conquered and settled large portions of England, Scotland and Ireland, founded Normandy, which would go on to conquer England, southern Italy and Sicily, opened trade routes from Greenland to Baghdad, transformed their own societies from pagan tribal structures to Christian kingdoms, created a literary culture that produced some of medieval Europe's greatest works. This is an extraordinary achievement for a population that probably never exceeded a few million people, and that started from one of the most marginal environments in Europe. The comparison to other great medieval civilizations is instructive. The Byzantine Empire of the same period was far more powerful, wealthy and sophisticated than any Viking polity. The Islamic world was experiencing a golden age of scientific, artistic and commercial achievement that dwarfed anything in Scandinavia. China under the Tang and Song dynasties was more populous, technologically advanced and economically developed than all of Europe combined. But none of these great civilizations showed the same transformative dynamism as Viking society. They were certainly changing and developing, but they weren't transforming themselves at the fundamental level that Viking society was. Within the span covered by this video, Scandinavian society changed almost beyond recognition, while Byzantium, the Islamic world and China remained recognizably the same civilizations they had been centuries before. This transformative quality is what makes the Vikings historically significant beyond their immediate achievements. They demonstrated that societies could change rapidly and fundamentally, that technological innovation could create new strategic possibilities, that geographic expansion could transform cultures, and that barbarian peoples could become equal participants in civilized society within a few generations. Conclusion. The end and the beginning. We've covered a lot of ground tonight, tracing Viking civilization from its origins in the harsh landscapes of Scandinavia, through its explosive expansion across 4 continents, to its eventual transformation into the medieval Scandinavian kingdoms. We've seen how climate change, population pressure, technological innovation and cultural values combine to create one of history's most dynamic civilizations. We've traced their evolution from raiders to traders, from pagans to Christians, from tribal societies to centralized kingdoms, but perhaps the most important insight is this. The Vikings succeeded not because they were somehow inherently superior or because they possessed some special warrior gene, but because they were adaptable. They could learn from their enemies, adopt new technologies, integrate into foreign societies, and completely reinvent themselves when circumstances changed. This adaptability, more than their famous dragon ships or their military prowess, is what allowed a few million people from one of Europe's most marginal regions to reshape the medieval world. The end of the Viking Age wasn't a defeat or a decline, but a transformation into something new. The descendants of Viking raiders became the kings of England, the dukes of Normandy, the princes of Kiev, and the merchant princes of Scandinavia. Viking culture didn't disappear. It evolved, contributing to the rich cultural mixture that became medieval and eventually modern European civilization. And in our own time, the Viking legacy persists. Every time we use words borrowed from Old Norse, every time we invoke trial by jury, every time we celebrate representative assemblies, every time we value exploration and innovation, we're drawing on traditions that the Vikings helped establish. The modern nations of Iceland, Denmark, Norway and Sweden trace direct continuity to Viking Age polities. The English language and English legal system show profound Viking influence. The very idea of the North Atlantic as a connected region rather than a barrier comes from Viking expansion. The Vikings matter because they show us what human societies are capable of when they combine technological innovation with cultural flexibility and strategic vision. They remind us that the people who seem most barbaric to settled civilizations are sometimes the ones who end up transforming those civilizations most profoundly. They demonstrate that rapid, fundamental cultural change is possible, and that geographic origin doesn't determine historical destiny. So the next time you see a pop culture depiction of Vikings as mindless berserkers in horned helmets, remember the reality: sophisticated navigators who crossed the Atlantic in open boats, adaptable colonizers who thrived from Russia to Greenland, innovative traders who connected Scandinavia to Baghdad, and dynamic societies that transformed themselves from tribal farmers to medieval kingdoms in less than 3 centuries. That's the real Viking story, and it's so much more fascinating than the myths. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Viking history, please consider subscribing to the channel. Leave a comment letting me know what aspect of the Viking Age you found most interesting, or what other historical topics you'd like to see covered. And if you want to learn more, I've compiled a comprehensive list of sources below. Thanks for joining me on this journey into the Viking Age. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical of easy answers, and keep exploring history.